In a state uniquely vulnerable to the forces of nature, Florida is often seen as ground zero for the impacts of global warming. But as my guest has reported, there is no safe place from climate change impacts, and much of the U.S. is far more vulnerable than previously thought. Laura Sullivan is a three-time Peabody and two-time DuPont Award winner, a former regular reporter on Morning Edition and All Things Considered, and now an NPR investigative correspondent. Her latest project is the PBS Frontline documentary, Hurricane Helene's Deadly Warning. Laura Sullivan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you visited the area of Appalachia hardest hit from Hurricane Helene right after the storm, and then you've continued to go back and visit. Is this storm different from the others that you've covered?
Each storm seems to be in a different kind of space. Like the flooding in Asheville was coming down these steep mountains. When we had been in Houston for Harvey, it was a low-lying plain. When we had been up in New York and Sandy for Hurricane Superstorm Sandy, it was this giant tidal surge. Each of them has their own component, but what they all seem to have in common is that none of these communities were ready for the storm that hit them. And none of them were able to, and none of us really can foresee how bad the impact these storms are going to have on the communities where they hit. A lot of what we've looked at is how difficult it is for communities to prepare for these storms, and in many ways, how bad a job we've done anticipating how disastrous these are going to be for communities.
And you note in the Frontline, you spoke to somebody saying Asheville used to be the safe place. Literally, people were moving there because they believed it was immune from this kind of, climate change driven storm activity. But your investigation really found out something shocking in terms of the communities that are vulnerable that just aren't aware of that possibility.
That's right. I mean, so many people told us I moved here to Asheville. I moved to the Western North Carolina because I wanted to get away from the threat of the oceans or the threat of wildfires or the threat of tornadoes. And I thought that I would be safe here. And they found that they were not. In so much of the research that we've done, you can see the increasing nature of the storms getting more significant, more severe as time passes. And some of these communities that thought they were safe are no longer safe. And what so many people told us is that there is no safe place to live anymore. Everything has a threat. And in North Carolina, especially in Western North Carolina, not only was it the flooding that came from the rivers, but it was the landslides, the mudslides that were taking down whole mountains. The tops of mountains were coming down on people and ended up killing, 23 people lost their lives in mudslides. So it was this deluge of rain that hung over the area for so long that created so much of this trauma for the people that live there. And so many of the way that communities have prepared for these storms has been insufficient. The federal government has tried to get people to build in different ways. Local communities sometimes try. Some states are doing better than others. But what we found in North Carolina was that a lot of these communities were building to older codes, to older standards, to older regulations, and were not prepared for this storm at all.
And also relying on FEMA flood maps. You talk to experts that have looked at what portion of the community was actually impacted that is in a designated flood zone. And you found a really extraordinary disparity there.
That's right. We found that only 2% of the community that was affected by Helene in Western North Carolina was actually mapped by FEMA in their flood zones. So this means that 98% of the community not only was out of luck when it came to flood insurance, but they also had spent the last half century as a community not building in a way, not being required to build in a way that might have helped them survive a storm better. And you see this nationally across the country as well. Some of the data that we looked at from a company called First Street found that 2 times as many Americans live in risky areas that are likely to flood in a storm, and have no idea that they even have that risk, let alone have built for that risk.
Florida is probably the most aware of its risk, out of the states because there have been hurricanes, sometimes several a year. It's a low-lying state, it's surrounded by water, and people are generally cognizant of the fact that there are some climate change risks. Other than building codes and having that knowledge to prepare and perhaps build in a different way, how else are the people caught unaware when they're in one of these areas that isn't considered necessarily at risk?
So, Florida is one of the states that has done in recent years what most experts are saying a remarkable job at updating its codes so that simple things like tying down the roofs and building the walls in such a way has made, and elevations have made the buildings withstand the storm so significantly that it's actually helping the state recover from the frequent disasters that Florida faces. A lot of people told us that some of the history of this was that Florida wasn't always so amenable to making changes to its building codes. But starting about 30 years ago, after storm after storm after storm, most people got on board. The pressure to not update building codes, to not build in a certain way, to not elevate homes is really coming from special interest groups like the home builders lobby, who argue that this will make homes unaffordable for Americans. A lot of people on the other side said what this is doing is putting really vulnerable people in vulnerable places without the kind of house that might be able to protect them.
Surely that has been a known influence in the state. Home builders lobby is very powerful in Florida. I think a lot of people look back at Hurricane Andrew as the genesis of a lot of those stricter building codes made necessary by disasters. But you talk to people in the political world too about the challenges of changing, for instance, flood zones and why that can be daunting to someone that is looking to be elected or reelected, because essentially you're putting upon your constituency a whole other layer of responsibility. Now you have to get flood insurance, for instance. Now you have to pay for that.
That's correct. And it's a very difficult thing we found for politicians to embrace the idea of having updated flood maps, updated flood zones, because it means that there's a whole new group of people who will now have to get flood insurance if they have a federally backed mortgage. That can be an extra expense for people. I think on the other side, a lot of communities are saying, we need this because we need to be able to recover when the storm hits. A lot of communities depend on that money, especially for homeowners, to be able to rebuild when the storm hits. So communities have joined this program, and they want to see, a lot of communities like Houston want to see their flood maps actually reflect the risk. There are other communities like New York, which has fought for a decade. They have not wanted to update their flood maps after Sandy. They said it was going to be too expensive for the homeowners who were going to have to buy insurance. It's a difficult debate because if people are not in risky areas, are not buying flood insurance or buying into that program, which is affordable compared to the damages that it faces, that means that taxpayers will pick up the bill for helping that community recover. So there's a number of people who told us that we are not properly pricing risk in this country, and we're allowing people to live in risky areas but not pay the bill for that.
We're talking about the technical aspects of your reporting. You also did a lot of reporting on the ground with people who were very personally impacted by this storm, including people who lost family members. You interviewed one woman whose husband, Omar, died in the flood waters. A neighbor actually had video of his home being washed away.
He did. It was so tragic for so many weeks, and for those all those months we spent in North Carolina to talk to the actual impact, to people facing the actual impact of these storms. It's sometimes easier to hear the number, to hear the statistic, and not realize that people are dying in terrible, horrible ways in these storms, that they should not have had to die in the first place or die in that manner. Zubila Shafiq's husband, Omar, was trapped in the balcony of his apartment building. The entire building that he was in was swept into this surge of 26 feet of water. This is not a flat lake that you're bobbing around in. This is a rush, a mad rush of water pouring down through the mountains of North Carolina, and it breaks homes apart into matchsticks. And his neighbors saw him panicking, and they told her what he had gone through as he was panicking, as the water and was engulfing him and the building was breaking apart, and he ultimately died. And she said that the image of him panicking as this was all unfolding was more than she could bear and kept her up at night, and has kept her up at night ever since.
Yeah, she said she thought of it every night trying to sleep. It's just astonishing. And yet you went back to that same community, they're rebuilding. You went to another community where the same thing is true, in the area of Swannanoa, which was really hard hit by the floods.
Swannanoa was leveled by just this incredible wall of water that came down from the mountains. And we went to a trailer home park that where a couple had lived just about 50 or 60 feet from the river's edge. They were only elevated a couple feet. And the water came through, and you could see in a few days after the storm that something had hit their building and taken the wall of the trailer home off. And they were renters there, and the water swept through and they were missing. And we met up with their daughter, who was trying to figure out what had happened to her parents. She was looking through the trailer for a note. Maybe they had left a note. She was saying to us, their cars are over here. Maybe they're still alive. And the more time she spent in the trailer, and she saw that the watermark was so high on the trailer wall, and knowing that her parents couldn't swim, even if they could swim, these are sort of white water rapids outside their building. They were in their 70s, and she just broke down crying because she knew that this probably meant that her parents were dead. When we returned to this area in Swannanoa, we found that they are rebuilding the space. We found they have put the property on the market, advertising it as a good space to rebuild a trailer home park, and advertising its abundant river frontage. And there is no mechanism in North Carolina for local communities to change the rules at the moment about what can be built where and how it's built. So there's very little that the county can do, or the town of Swannanoa can do, to put in new rules to say, look, if you're going to build here, we want you to be even higher. We want you to be building in this certain way. And it was especially tragic because while we were there, you could see there was one row of duplexes that had been built to the most modern standards. They had flood vents underneath. They were elevated. They were set back from the river. And they were some of the only structures still standing when we went out there.
Astonishing that that land is being, advertised for its riverfront, river frontage. But one thing that you found in your reporting was that the year before Helene, that the home builders lobby there had basically blocked an attempt to update building codes, and that there's a huge swath of this country that, people are living in towns and communities that do not have up-to-date building codes.
That's correct. More than 70% of the communities in the country do not have hazard resistant building codes at this point. And a lot of the people we talked to said this is because the strength of the home builders lobby is so strong that it is resisting having communities update the codes. One of the most significant things that can happen when you have a state like North Carolina, which is rated a 0 out of 100 by FEMA for its hazard resistance, is that they can often become the dumping ground for the products, for the materials that other states won't stand for anymore, because North Carolina's codes are updated every 6 years. most communities are updated every 3 years. And with those longer code cycles and some of this legislation that then prevents other codes from being updated in particular bills, you see a state fall farther and farther behind. And the way that they build then becomes, as a lot of critics said, less resilient and less able to withstand the storm. So if you don't have codes in place and elevation standards in place, you end up with trailers right next to rivers that flood repeatedly. And the home builders lobby has told us that they are trying to build affordable homes. And that is true. The trailers next to the Swananoa River were an affordable place to live. It is also true that that couple ended up dead in the storm.
So it is, when you're looking at places like New Jersey, like Texas, like the mountains of, Asheville and in North Carolina, it's clear that there aren't safe places, and nobody knows who is next when it comes to this kind of devastating impact. But your reporting makes clear that this is not a problem that's going away.
That's true. And we saw communities tackle it in very different ways. When we went up to New York, this was a place that was really, everybody was on the same page with building codes and standards. And they said, you know what, we're going to get out of the way of water. The floods are going to come, so we're going to get out of the way. So they launched into a years long effort to buy people out, have taxpayers buy out the properties in these dangerous areas and move them away. They ended up buying out more than 500 homes in Staten Island. And in doing that, everybody thought this was going to be a fantastic success story. But when we got there, we saw a lot of sort of desolate neighborhoods where half the people had left and half the people had stayed, and some of them had elevated and some had done nothing at all. And they, people in the neighborhoods called it the jack-o'-lantern effect, after the teeth of the jack-o'-lantern. And now that it's been 13 years since Sandy, there's a real movement in these communities to rebuild on the lots that taxpayers purchased and were supposed to be returned to wetlands. So it never turned out to be the vision that was initially promised all those years ago. And in Houston, they tackled it a different way. They decided they were going to build their way out of the water. They were going to do huge and enormous infrastructure projects. And we got there and we found out that these very expensive projects were only providing incremental change. And most of the officials there told us that if Harvey happened tomorrow, it would flood exactly the same.
It is terrific reporting. Laura Sullivan is an NPR investigative correspondent. Her latest project is the PBS Frontline documentary, Hurricane Helene's Deadly Warning. You can find links to it on the WJCT website. Laura Sullivan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.